So now that we've covered the right hand a bit, we're going to get into talking about the left hand. And the first thing we want to touch on is how we want the left hand set up. And we have kind of two schools on the left hand. We have the more traditional blues look where you've got the first finger really up against the side of the neck, and that's great for our bending and vibrato. And then we've got the more modern or classical style where we're out like this, much better for stretches. And the way I like to approach this is taking aspects of both, really using both and going between them depending on the phrase that you're playing. Now this will take a bit longer to get the hang of because of course it's easier to just use one left hand technique for everything. But the issue with this is if we just use the more traditional blues style of left hand, we'll get into these spots where, say we want a big reach. It's hard for me to get around the neck that way. You heard me even not able to get to that last note very easily. On the contrary, if we're trying to use a bend with this hand position, the more modern or classical hand position, we're not going to have any pivot point to play that bend or vibrato, and we're going to rely too much on the fingers. And that's where you get sometimes this sound with a bend, where it's a really lazy sounding bend with no structure to it. So we want to take aspects of both and just use them for each context. So looking at the more modern or classical style of left hand first, that's going to be when we have our thumb is going to be around the back of the neck, and it's going to be up towards the low E string side and somewhere positioned usually behind the first or second finger of the left hand. And then the really important thing to look at here is that there should be a gap between the side of your first finger and the treble side of the neck. If there's not, that means you're really locking onto the side and you're more in that traditional blues position. But the other thing to be aware of here is that you're not just separated from the neck and looking like this, because now my wrist is at a pretty extreme angle. I like to think of everything being very neutral in terms of my wrist and finger angles. This not only helps you to play guitar easier and accomplish the lines and licks you want better, but it also helps with avoiding some pretty terrible injuries such as carpal tunnel, etc., or overuse injuries, because it's putting yourself in a more relaxed, better position. So the other little, I guess, memory trick I always use to remember how to set up my left hand, and I teach this a lot, is to think of your fingers like tabletops where you could balance something right on top for that more modern style. And this keeps the hand in a very, very relaxed position. Again, it's great if you're going for some of those bigger bends, like if you want to bridge two different shapes of the pentatonic, which we'll touch on later. If I'm locked to the side in the traditional sense, I can play it, it's just a lot more difficult. Now, getting into the more traditional left hand, which is great for all your bending, vibrato. The major difference here is the thumb can either stay where it was or it can kind of creep up over the bass side of the neck. Personally, I end up using the thumb quite a bit for chords, kind of like Hendrix, Mike Landau does that, a ton of guys end up doing that so that you can put more extensions on top and have more fingers available. But the major thing is that this part, right, the side, kind of that first joint of the first finger is going to be touching the treble side of the neck. And what this does is for both bending and vibrato, that works as a pivot point. There are many different schools on the best way to bend and use vibrato with the left hand. I have a pretty strong preference towards the one that I teach because I think it provides the most control as well as the easiest to master, since it's the same technique for bending and vibrato, since vibrato is really just a series of mini bends. So it all stems from having the left hand set up, as I talked about, with the more traditional blues left hand style, and then using almost a royal wave motion where it sometimes feels like it's coming from the left wrist. It's really your forearm kind of turning in the joint from the elbow. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to bend the 10th fret on the G string right inside that C minor pentatonic box that we'll talk more about later. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to fret the note with my third finger. I'm going to use my first and second fingers behind that note to brace, and then using that point on my first finger as a pivot point, I'm just going to turn my wrist like that. The thumb's job with the bend is to provide a counter pressure, because you're pushing up towards the ceiling pretty strong, and what we don't want to see is for the neck to do anything like that. We want the neck to stay in one place and just the string to move like this. And demonstrating that with a couple other fingers, it's exactly the same whether you're using the fourth finger, the second finger. First finger gets tricky if you're doing more than a half step bend, but for example, fourth finger. And on that note, I added some vibrato as well. And then second finger, exact same idea. With whatever finger you have behind the one you're bending with, you're going to use that to brace, and it's just going to be this turning motion. We have both down bends, or bends where the string is going towards the floor, and one's going towards the ceiling. You'll find that you're of course forced to bend up towards the ceiling on the B and E string, because if you bent down, we'd be off the neck. On most other strings, unless in context of a lick, it's necessary to bend up. I like to bend towards the floor, because this motion of kind of the hand grabbing a bit more instead of pushing out is a stronger and more controllable motion. So a couple examples of some of those bends.